The X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X-Zone Radio Show or endorsed in any manner by Rob McConnell, Relmar McConnell Media Company, the X-Zone Broadcast Network, its affiliated networks, stations, employees, or advertisers.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X-Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
And welcome to the X-Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell. It's a Friday afternoon, and I hope everyone is well and doing fine, getting ready for a nice summer weekend. We don't have that many summers left in the weekend, so please go out, have a great time, but be careful. And remember, if you drink, don't drive. My guest this first hour of the X-Zone is a gentleman that we've had the pleasure of talking to several times. Peter Woolford is his name. He joins us from the United Kingdom. Peter is the author of the Genesis Grid. Said he used to search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and Peter's website is www.genesisgrid.co.uk. And Peter, it's always a great pleasure having you with us. How have you been, my good friend? And did you get to see any of the Olympics that were actually happening in the UK?
Yes, Rob, I saw quite a few of them, and it was very enjoyable to see the athletes who were very sort of enthusiastic and pleasantly spoken people, unlike some of our sportsmen. So I think they were a terrific advertisement for the UK.
Well, that's great, Peter. I was wondering if you could give our listeners, some of who have just joined us over the last couple of weeks since your last visit with us here, about the pattern you claim that is hidden in the Bible.
Yes, a very brief overview is to really point out the eclipse, which is where it is centered on, and Isaac Asimov described the eclipse as the strangest coincidence imaginable. It's actually a double coincidence because not only does the disk of the moon fit precisely over the disk of the sun, it does so in a way that it relates to a round number, the number 400, because the sun is 400 times wider and 400 times further away than the moon, and that is what produces the effect. But you could produce the same effect if it was 323 or 521, but it just happens to be that very round number. And the other aspect, which you'll be aware of, is the Bullinger, the theologian who found that in the Bible the two leading personalities are tagged with the numbers 7 and 11, and through astronomical knowledge we can see that the moon and the sun are also tagged with the same numbers, 7 and 11.
Now, Peter, you've also related the discoveries of the Genesis Grid book to the current economic crisis in Europe. And I must say, Peter, that you and I once talked about the German influence. And it's only been this past week, Peter, and I spoke about you to many of my friends and fellow media people here in Canada, that our Prime Minister Harper tried to strike up a secret accord with the German Chancellor while preparing for the EU free trade agreement that Canada is trying to put forth.
Yes, I'm not surprised at the secrecy, Rob. Everything to do with the EU is cloaked in secrecy, double dealing, and frankly, if I may say so, hypocrisy. They're very, very keen to conceal their true agenda. Actually, the president of the EU, chap Jose Manuel Barroso, who was actually a rather open chap,
right,
he said back in 2007, he made a big gaffe because he wasn't supposed to say this. He said that we now have in the EU, and this is his words, what we have is the first non-imperial empire. Now, that really rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. Now, one of his spokesmen immediately shot out and said, actually, don't worry, everybody, nobody needs to have imperial nightmares. The EU member states came together peacefully, democratically, and voluntarily. Of course, that's totally untrue. We were shanghaied into it. And we were lied to by our own politicians. Anybody who's followed the EU story knows that it's absolutely drenched in deceit, hypocrisy, and craftiness.
Unlike
Sorry.
your book, which is very well done, it's an honest interpretation, and startling revelations can be found in the pages of the Genesis Grid, www.genesisgrid.co.uk. Peter Woolford is the author. He's my guest this hour. And Peter and I will be back on the other side of this commercial break in 2 minutes as the X Zone continues from our studios in beautiful Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away. Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X Zone radio show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X Zone broadcast network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan, and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember, 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365. The website is www.genesisgrid.co.uk. Here's a question, Peter, and I don't ever think I've asked you this. What does Her Majesty say about the EU and the economic crisis?
Well, back when it erupted in 2008, the Queen actually went public. Now, she never... This is the amazing thing. You know the Queen's a very, very restrained person and very impartial and never intervenes in public affairs at all. But on this occasion, she put her head above the parapet and she said, "Oi, excuse me, why didn't any economist warn us that this was on the way, that this crisis was on the way?"
Exactly.
Good question, you know? And the truth is that although we have had some pundits and commentators who were warning about the overheating of this or that, nobody has remotely predicted an economic crisis of this scale. I mean, as you know, people like Ben Bernanke have said this is bigger than the 1930s.
That's right.
You know, so this is absolutely mega. And the relevance to my book was that you may recall that at the beginning of my book, I do introduce an interesting event in 2003 where there were 8 power cuts over a very short period of time spaced around the globe. And it's quite astonishing because if you actually Google power cuts and you go through them painstakingly, which I have done, you'll see that there's this cluster, very tight cluster of mega power cuts. We're talking about the biggest power cuts in history, the blanking out of the entire Roman Peninsula, over 50 million people in darkness, the blanking out of New York and states right across to Detroit and up into Canada. These were the biggest power cuts ever. There were 8 of them around the globe, and they came within 44 days. I thought that was so remarkable that I recorded it, and I didn't, you know, I hadn't made the discovery of my book at that time, but I was just astonished to see all these power cuts. London was blacked out, and places in Europe, Georgia, huge power cuts. Kuala Lumpur, places that they never ever normally occur in, because Kuala Lumpur, for example, has brand new electric system. So when I saw these strange power cuts, I made a note of them, and I saw that actually they do describe a figure of 8 across the planet, you see, which I thought, well, this is remarkable. So then I had the vague idea that there might actually be a figure of 8 in time, and I'll tell you why I had this idea, because the last power cut was in Rome, affected the whole of Italy, and it was right bang in the middle of a pattern in the Bible, a pattern of religious observance days. I can't go into too much detail without visual aids here.
Sure.
But suffice it to say, it seemed a very significant date. So the astonishing thing was that I saw that actually the Northern Rock, which was our bank in the UK, where we had the first national bank run in over 140 years, where people were literally queuing in the night to get their money, this was actually the trigger that set off this greatest of all economic crisis. And we're talking about, you know, people like Charles Bean, deputy head of the Bank of England, saying this is the greatest economic crisis in the whole of history, nothing to compare to it. And it was set off in England, and it was set off by a bank called the Northern Rock, and it was set off exactly to the day, to the hour, actually, in the night, 4 years after the Pope and Italy was blacked out on the last of the 8 power cuts. So there's always this pattern of 8. I thought, well, there's 2 equidistant points in time there, 4 years. And I asked the question, and I actually put this in my book, and it's there. The question is posed: what will happen 4 years later? Will there be a figure of 8 in time? 3 equidistant nodes separated by 4 years in each direction over a span of 8 years. It was just a question, but I said, I think there will be a pattern. I think this is so powerful, this can't be coincidence. So that's why I was looking very carefully to see what would happen on the 29th of October last year. And sure enough, there were some very, very powerful events to do with the expansion of Europe into, they had a conference in Warsaw. They did the big vote for the 211 billion euros in the Bundestag in Germany to release that money. That was the first and only big tranche of money going in, real money, not printed money, taxpayers' money going into a rescue fund for Europe. It happened on that very day, the 29th. And then within an hour, Angela Merkel was on a plane to Warsaw. What were they doing? They were planning, they were having a big meal with all the heads of state of Europe. There was no published agenda. It was a secret meeting. And the next day, they expanded the EU in 2 directions. Leftwards into North Africa, where Catherine Ashton went to Tunisia to do a deal with the Tunisians, and into the east, where they were having the conference about bringing in Azerbaijan and all these ex-Soviet kind countries into the EU to expand it. So far from the EU collapsing, the EU is getting bigger and stronger. Whatever we read in the newspapers, have to take it with a pinch of salt.
Now, Peter, is it, as I'm listening to you talk, and you're talking about the expansion of the EU, is the EU the actual one new world order that we've been hearing about?
Well, I'm inclined to think that it's perhaps it is really the most important element, and it's not generally considered to be so, because everybody's afraid of China.
Yeah.
Everybody's obviously very preoccupied with false flag operations. We've had all the release of information from the 1950s about American false flag operations recently under, I don't know why this information was released, but we have laws in this country, and I imagine they do in the USA, to release information after a certain amount of time. It's quite well known and apparent that there are false flag operations. A lot of people think that 9/11 was, some people think that London bombings were, a false flag operation to give the pretext to governments to do what they want to do. This idea, the Alex Jones concept of, the New World Order, I'm inclined very much to believe in that. I think there is a conspiracy. World leaders are doing things behind the scenes that we don't know about. And I think the big summit on the 29th of October last year, completing this most mysterious and strange figure of 8, which I could never have dreamt of in my wild imaginings if it hadn't been staring me in the face, I think that had a great deal to do with it. And yes, I do think that Europe is going to be the biggest thing in the future affecting this world. And in fact, I think that while we all like a quiet life and to see our grandchildren grow up in a peaceful world, I think Europe is going to bring the most awful catastrophe onto this world within, maybe, I don't know, 20 years. Who knows? It's always a guessing game to know how quickly things will happen, but they're not ones to waste a good crisis. They're using. Sorry?
It seems as if history has an 8-year cycle of repeating itself.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a cliche, isn't it? They say, if you don't learn the lessons of history, you're fated to repeat them.
Yes.
Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, there are a lot of echoes from the 1930s. I think that one of your own professors, in fact, John David Dershowitz, I think his name is, he's a Canadian professor of history. I think he's in Toronto. But Dershowitz says that Ahmadinejad is the Hitler of the 21st century. That's what he says.
And we're also watching tensions rise dramatically between Israel and Iran, with experts around the world saying Israel is going to do a first strike on Iran before the U.S. presidential elections.
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much of this speculation about it for so long. But the interesting thing to me is that Ahmadinejad, now he got into power in March 2003 as mayor of Tehran. And he had been the student leader running the uprising where they took over the American embassy in 1978, leading to the ousting of Jimmy Carter. He was the guy running that show. And all these years later, he comes back and becomes president of Iran. 3 months after he became the mayor, he became the president. And that was at the very time that the Americans were going into Iraq. And he got that job as a direct result of that invasion. But he's been in power ever since, and people are saying, oh, you know, Ahmadinejad's falling out with this leader, he's falling out with that religious leader, you know, but he's hung on. He's been there now over 9 years.
Yeah.
And he doesn't look like leaving anytime soon.
No, he doesn't. But what it shows is that if you get the kind of person that he is at the helm, whether your religious philosophies used to hold so much clout with the previous head of state, that when it changes at the top, it has the trickle effect that we're seeing in Iran today.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're very set on their path.
Yeah.
They're all very much of a mindset. They're very much willing to use even the rape weapon against their own populations to keep them subdued. And they have done that, and they have tortured, and they have threatened people with the most dreadful things if they don't comply. As you know, they did have an attempted green revolution or some such revolution in Iran before the eruption of the Arab Spring. It was an entirely one-off event, if you like, in Iran, but it was brutally repressed. So, I mean, he's done, you know, he is better at suppressing unrest than even Assad in Syria is. He was very successful. And that's why I think when I look at what Ahmadinejad has done to suppress dissent and what these other guys have not been able to do in the Arab countries, it shows you just how enduring his rulership is. And he's like a sort of a modern-day Stalin. But I think the really interesting thing about Ahmadinejad is the language, the fact that it is the language of the 1930s. It is the language of Hitler. It is the language of, you know, the extermination and vilification of minorities.
We're seeing a lot of unrest in the Middle East. We have the continuing massacre of civilians in Syria. We've got Egypt that is finally seeming to get under control. We have the conflict that is boiling between Israel and Iran. We've got the economic crisis in the EU. We have the economic crisis in the United States and Canada. It seems that this world, my friend, is going to hell in a hurry. And you and I will be back on the other side of this commercial break to talk more. Peter, it's always great talking to you.
Okay.
And by the way, congratulations. You're going to be a granddad shortly.
Yes, it's very exciting. Very
Excellent.
Exciting indeed. Thank you, Rob.
Peter, stand by, friend. We'll be back on the other side of the news break. Peter Woolford is my special guest this hour, X Zone Nation, a good friend of the X Zone. www.genesisgrid.co.uk. I'll be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news as we continue here in the X Zone from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. My name is Rob McConnell. Don't go away.
This is the X Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan, and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember, 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365. And welcome back, everyone. This is the X-Zone. My name is Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Worldwide toll-free, 1-800-610-7035. Email xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. On MSN Messenger, xzoneradiotv@hotmail.com. And our website, www.xzoneradiotv.com. Peter Woolford is my special guest this hour. And Peter is the author of The Genesis Grid. And his website is www.genesisgrid.co.uk. Peter, we talked about the conflicts that are growing worldwide, and it seems to be there's total unrest everywhere. We've got the pollution problem in China that is affecting North America. We've got the overpopulation in certain Asian countries that are starting to be a concern to the rest of the world. We're running out of food. We're running out of water. And what really, really boils my blood is to think how much money is being spent on sending crap to Mars instead of on the problems here on Earth. What is your opinion, Peter? I've never asked you this on the space program. And should we spend $2.9 billion on getting something on Mars?
Well, I have to say I do rather admire the people who are doing this. And it sounds like a lot of money, but we printed trillions of pounds to save ourselves from bankers who were running banks very badly. Mm-hmm. They were borrowing short and lending long, weren't they? And then when the money markets dried up, their bank collapsed. That's what happened to us in the UK. And even humble UK has had to print, in effect, many, many billions of pounds just to rescue us from their stupidity. But and, of course, it hasn't worked. So I don't know that I really totally agree on that. I rather admire what these people are doing with their relatively small sums of money. And so far as the world starving and all the rest of it, look, most of the time we're just not using the resources we've got. If you look at this country, we've only built on 1% of the country.
Wow.
99% of it is still available. We could build millions of houses. We've got millions of unemployed people. We have the know-how. We have the natural resources in terms of materials. We could build everything we want, and we could grow a lot more food than we do. But we don't. Why? Because we're paralyzed as a country. We just can't run things properly. So I don't really think that cancelling trips to Mars is going to really solve anything.
No, but if you were to take all the knowledge and all the engineering and science that goes into the lunar or the Mars mission and take those scientists away from going onto a planet and having them concentrate on this planet. If you can put a car on Mars, I'm sorry, but something tells me you can also find an alternative for the fossil fuel crisis that we're having right now.
Yes, but I think the problem there is corruption, isn't it? Vested interests controlling government policy.
But that brings up the question, what is the corruption that's involved with the Mars missions? Because if there's corruption within the fossil fuel industry, there has to be a greater alternative, not an alternative, but a greater cause on why they're going to Mars than just to find out whether or not life was there or not.
It's difficult to know. I'm not an insider, but
yeah.
I think that curiosity is one of the greatest driving forces in human nature. I think one of the reasons they're going is they want to find life. And I think one of the reasons they want to find life is that they would like to deny the possibility that there may be higher powers that have either created the human race or that have in some way set up our environment here on Earth. Whether that's a god or deity or deities or aliens of any kind. Recent question we discussed a few months ago was Richard Dawkins' comment that the first living cell probably came from an alien, somebody who'd evolved in another planet and brought a living cells down here to make us, in which case who gave them their first living cell. But you see, the point is, I think that part of the drive to find life is really a subconscious desire to resist the idea of a creator or an alien power or anything that might have be superior to the human race. they're hoping to find little bugs crawling around on Mars so they can say, well, there you are, life evolved on this planet. But actually, I was reading some material someone passed me last night about scientific quotes of scientists who are opposed to evolution. And while I'm certainly not one of these people who thinks the world's 6,000 years old, because it's very obviously billions of years old, and the universe is billions of years old, I am inclined to think, as Richard Dawkins thinks, that there must have been some kind of outside intervention to create life on this planet. So maybe that is one of the reasons that they have this drive to go to other planets. But I still think that the solution to our problems on this planet, in terms of economics and food production, are to do with corruption, to do with the lobbying of politicians by vested interests, particularly multinational companies. Unfortunately, the multinationals are now more powerful than the politicians.
Peter, in your book, The Genesis Grid, which by the way I've read, you mention the Catholic Church quite a lot. If this is about the Bible pattern, where does the Catholic Church and the Vatican fit in?
Well, this is a very good question, because in fact, as you will know from your vast experience of speaking to people and reading books over the years, as well as from my own book, that the Catholic religion has very little to do with the Bible. You know, it might have use some of the names and personalities from the Bible.
Right.
But, you know, if you take the range of doctrines, you know, Trinity Sundays, Easter, the immortal soul, heaven and hell, Mary worship, you know, all these things have got nothing to do with the Bible at all. So really, that is a good question in that regard. And I think the significance of what the Catholic Church stands for, in respect to my book, is that what they offer is a counterfeit version of biblical Christianity. And when you actually find out what is prescribed in the Bible, it is connected with a pattern, which, as you'll recognize from my book, it's a very simple pattern, 171171. And you can read that backwards, 1711171, because it's a symmetrical pattern. Those numbers encompass the straightforward, simple, biblical system of religious worship, which is totally rejected by Catholicism, and for which they have substituted their own religion. That pattern is a Bible pattern, and therefore, if you're going to show that something exists in the Bible, you have to use material from the Bible. And it just so happens that the abbreviated form of that pattern is 1711, which fits the Genesis grid. So no time to explain all of that in any depth. Suffice it to say that the system of religion promoted by Catholicism is false, and I reject it, just as I reject all religions, but I do believe that I have proved that the Bible was inspired by someone or something, because the grid pattern appears in it 11 times from Genesis to Revelation.
You know, most of us, Peter, are preoccupied with earning a living. People in the UK and throughout Europe and Canada, the US went to the Olympics. Our children, our grandchildren. So how does the pattern, or how does a pattern in the Bible affect us or make any difference in our lives?
Well, generally it wouldn't, except to say this, that the point is that the Bible is the most important book in history, I believe. That can be demonstrated. And an awful lot of people are being killed, actually, even just trying to translate it, never mind anything else. So it is an extremely important book. Now, the point is, I would say that the predictive power of that book is astounding. And once you're familiar with particularly the second chapter of Daniel and the predictions there about world empires, you realize very quickly that the EU, the emerging EU, which is going to be an enormous empire, very closely matches those predictions, and it really is like a modern equivalent of the Roman Empire. For example, I found recently a European think tank. It's called the Group on Grand Strategy, GOGS. What they're doing is they are planning an EU-controlled grand area. It stretches from the Arctic down through Central Asia, which would include countries like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, bordering China this would be, and then right down into the Middle East, obviously taking in Syria. They have advanced plans for the takeover or influence and control of Syria after Assad has gone. But this will be an enormous empire stretching out also to North Africa. Now, you remember that the Germans in World War II were very active in North Africa
Yes.
with the
Yeah.
desert rats, and so on. Tunisia was the target, has been the target diplomatically of European initiatives. As I told you on that critical date last year, the 29th of the 9th, there was a high representative of the EU going down on that very day to Tunisia to sign deals with them, just as they were signing deals with these other countries I mentioned, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, all bordering China. These countries are the target for a greater EU. So far from the EU withering away, it is going to build an enormous empire in that area, right from the top of the earth, right down the middle of Asia and across westwards into North Africa and taking over the Middle East. That's what they're planning. It's absolutely massive, and it fits the description of the Bible. So the point is, here is a war-making machine, and the prediction in the book of Revelation describes it as, it asks the question, the rhetorical question, who can make war with it? Who can make war with its power? And it is going to terrorize the world, I'm afraid.
Is this going to be a holy war, or is this going to be a war strictly on conquering?
The prophecies do indicate that Europe will take over the Middle East, including Jerusalem. Ultimately, Jerusalem will be the target, and the Catholic Church will be hand in hand in this process. They make no secret that they have already substantial diplomatic and legal powers in Jerusalem over various holy sites, and they are doing deals with the Israelis. The Germans are very, very close to the Israelis. And when you read EU, you should actually put brackets, Germany, close brackets, because
Wow.
Germany is running the EU. And, this is a German-run juggernaut. It is unstoppable. It's like a huge lorry running down a very steep hill. Nobody's going to stop this. This is going to be a German-led, German-run. Eventually, it will become a tyranny.
All right, so let me ask you this, Peter. If someone would have had a crystal ball at the end of World War II and seen the power Germany was going to have, do you think that the war outcome would have been different?
Yes, I think, things might have been done differently. Churchill was very in favor of a united Europe, and this was an idea floated around since before World War I.
Wow.
By guys who were all Catholics. They were all they were all Catholics, every single one of them, and most of them were Jesuits as well. But he was in favor of that, and I don't know why he couldn't see the fact that anything run by the Pope could be dodgy. I mean, in fact, H.G. Wells, the author, was Churchill's Minister of Information briefly during the war, and he asked this question. He said, "Why not bomb Rome?" And that's probably why I didn't stay in the job very long. But, I don't know what the link was between the UK and the Vatican, if any.
Mm-hmm.
But Rome always seems to have escaped. But I think that certainly had people realized how dangerous a resurgent Germany would be, they might have done things differently. And Margaret Thatcher asked that question of our Professor Norman Stone in 1990, shortly before losing her job. She looked back on what had happened the year before in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, and she said to Professor Norman Stone, she called him over to Chequers for a special chat. And she said, "I'm very worried about German unification." He said, "Oh, you've got nothing to worry about German unification. There's no danger, there's no risk in that whatsoever." Now, that's what he told her 22 years ago. Not looking like that now. It's looking like Germany is a very, very dangerous, out-of-control country that despises the rule of law, and which is going to have an incredible impact on the world in years to come, and a negative impact, I'm sorry to say.
Peter, you and I have to take our commercial break, our final break for this hour. But before we go to the break, I'd just like to say it seems to me, Peter, that Hitler was a pawn in this grand scheme.
Well, I don't know that you could describe him as a pawn. It depends on your interpretation. But I think if you're going to talk about maybe occult forces and powers, then okay, maybe he was a pawn. Maybe that's a theory that you could advance. But he and Mussolini had that axis together. That axis lasted 444 weeks, in fact. And the funny thing is, in my book, I do show that 444 pattern in the grid. I compare that to Babylon, the fall of Babylon, the famous writing on the wall in Daniel. That was a 444 pattern. And, of course, the siege of the Tehran U.S. embassy, that was a 440-day pattern. So you've got the 444 coming up 3 times in 3 big turning points in history.
Peter, stand by. We've got to take our final break. Peter Woolford is my guest, X-Zone Nation. www.genesisgrid.co.uk. My name is Rob McConnell. This is the X-Zone, a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. We're coming to you from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. I'll be back on the other side of this break with Peter Woolford, the author of the Genesis Grid. Don't go away.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
And welcome back, everyone. Peter Woolford is my special guest this hour. Peter is the author of the Genesis Grid. www.genesisgrid.co.uk. That's genesisgrid.co.uk. Peter, you're not the first person to claim to have found patterns in the Bible. Were the others wrong, or how is your discovery better?
Well, I would point, first of all, I think, to the book that came out 12 years ago. This was called The Bible Code, and it was written by a chap called Michael Drosnin, assisted by an Israeli mathematician. A number of mathematicians objected to this book, and in fact they formed a consortium of about 50 international statisticians who got together to oppose him. Some of them were Bible-believing types who actually were Jews and believed in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. They weren't opposing him because of that. They were opposing him because they felt his claims were false. And what they said was, look, you found certain patterns. We could find the same patterns in any book. We could find them in Moby Dick. And he said, well, go on, do it then. So they did. They did find the same sort of patterns, and the sort of patterns he was finding were things like, for example, he'd get computers to jumble all the letters around, and then there would be something like a tower falling would come out. You say, oh, that's very topical, a tower falling, you see. But then a leader gets killed. It might have been Prime Minister Rabin was one he talked about a lot. But the conclusion was that, in fact, all he was doing was just cherry-picking the most topical and interesting things and showing, well, this one points to that one across the page, and this one's diagonal in direction of that one across the page. But at the end of the day, it was all a lot of hot air, and it didn't amount to anything. That's the exact opposite of anything that I've done, because what I did was I stumbled upon a very small, very tight, little simple pattern, which is marked out in the heavens by the sun and the moon and the way they move around the moon, the earth and the moon, the way they move around the sun. A very simple pattern. It can be shown that it is clearly and indelibly stamped on the Bible.
Is it possible then, Peter, the Holy Trinity isn't the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, but the Holy Trinity in actuality is the sun, the moon, and the earth?
Well, I don't think so. And in fact, what I've shown is that the very thing that the theologian Bullinger discovered 100 years ago, that the two leading personalities, the Father and the Son, of the Bible are tagged with the numbers 11 and 7. But this Trinitarian concept is not biblical, and in fact this phenomenon that the Bible mentions of a spirit, Bullinger never went there. He never investigated it, because I think that as a Trinitarian he was afraid that his views would not be supported. When I investigated it, I found that in fact the word, the Holy Spirit expression, occurs 308 times in the entirety of the Bible, which was an exact match with derivative numbers from the grid, and it's not possible to really explain that in any greater depth. Suffice it to say that it was obvious that the identity number for that phenomenon was 1, and as 1 is not a prime number, it was not part of any Trinitarian set, so that the Genesis grid pattern contradicts the idea of a Trinity just as does the Bible itself.
Peter, I hate to do this, but we've run out of time for tonight. I want to thank you ever so much for joining me, my good friend. I know the X-Zone Nation loves hearing from you. And once again, congratulations, Grandpa.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye now. Peter Woolford has been my guest this hour. We'll have Peter back in the future. He's a great guy and a good friend. His book is The Genesis Grid. His website, www.genesisgrid.co.uk. I'll be back on the other side of the news at 6.5 minutes past as we continue here in the X-Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell.